Welcome to Game Retail Ramblings. I'm your host, Travis Severance, coming to you live from It's Very, Very Muddy Outside, Rochester, New York. We're going to talk all about Project K today. I had the opportunity to go to GAMA and actually get to play with the cards physically. One of the things I want to say right out of the gates is they have changed the frames. The frames that you're going to see that we're going to show, that we're going to splice in, are not the frames you're going to actually see in the cards, so we're going to be judicious about that. Pretty excited. Like, all of this League of Legends, all of my dolls, I guess, my statues behind me. This is my collection, and it's like only 1/3 of my collection. So as far as knowing the brand and understanding the brand, I meant to look this up too, but I started playing League whatever the week was that Urgot came out. So I've been playing League for a long time. I love trading card games as well. So this is like, you know, basically the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup of my life. I'm really excited about this topic to be able to talk to, and hopefully all of you are as well. Thanks to everybody that watched the show 2 weeks ago. Last week I was obviously at GAMA in Louisville. I had a great time there. I appreciate talking with all the different publishers and all the retailers that caught up with me and everybody that said positive things about the show. That's really encouraging for me. You guys are the reason why I'm here. I'm not doing this to talk into a screen. I'm actually not the most social creature in the world, so this is me getting out of my comfort zone and trying to help other people out. The TCG market, pretty full. Cards on the table, literally and figuratively. When Project K was announced, I sort of poo-pooed it. And I sort of poo-pooed it, and the reason why I poo-pooed it was that initially when it was talked about being launched, it sounded like it was only going to be in China. There wasn't, nobody was assigned to North America or English, or they didn't specifically speak to it being a thing here. When I was looking at it as a 2v2 game, I was like, oh, a 2v2 game is not going to do really well in the American market right out of the gates. And there was a bunch of questions and concerns that I had with it. The frames, that sort of thing, you know, the rest of the community sort of jumped on that as well. They were not thrilled with the frames, and it sort of looked like a dated Bandai game, which nothing against Bandai. Bandai makes some really beautiful stuff, and we sell a lot of their games. But what I'm accustomed to seeing for Riot and the brand Riot and all the different interactions that I've had with Riot is not basic. It's not a vanilla brand. It's not a vanilla license. If I look at League of Legends or Teamfight Tactics, or if I look at Legends of Runeterra for as long as I played that game, which was all of the pandemic basically, and Valorant, these are all games that are sort of next level games. They all play really well. The presentation, the production, that's never been an issue. So when I saw those initial frames, to me, they didn't really sound like the quality or look like the quality that I'm used to sort of seeing when it comes to Riot. I've gone out to the LA studios before. I was a guest of when Rick Fox had his team. I was a guest there one time, so I got to watch the show and see it live with a friend of mine. TCG market's super wide right now. There's a ton of games in it. Is there space for this one or not? We're going to sort of get into that a little bit. I'm planning on talking about the mechanics a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I expect the future for this game to be. And I'll start sort of with the beginning, which is UVS Games press release came out just before GAMA saying that they're the ones that are going to be handling distribution in the English language. And they talked about having it in different markets and moving into a place where other markets are going to have the game, but they specifically talked about North America, and they talked about other things inside of that. So my relationship with UVS Games goes back a couple of years, and I was curious when Jasco sold, a new company came in and bought them, and I didn't know anything about them. Locally, I have another store owner named Sean O'Brien from Rochester CCG. He does a lot with the UVS Universes game, and a lot of our local players have done really well inside of that game. So I went down to Texas for their World Championship one year no, it wasn't even a Worlds, it was a Nationals, because Worlds was in Vegas and I went there too. I went down there to sort of see what the state of the game was. I had some free time and I wanted to get to know who these guys were. Sean was nice enough to introduce me. I met Paul and Samir. I had the opportunity to have some real good sort of high, medium, and low business level conversations, and it was some of the best conversations that I've had in a long time for somebody that was sort of brand new to the space. Neither Samir nor Paul had come from gaming at large. They had come from different backgrounds and stuff, and this was sort of their first swing in the gaming market. Not only did we have some really good conversations about that, they had some really intelligent ideas. They were really hungry. Young guys that were hungry. They wanted to do something. They wanted to make a splash. So fast forward a couple of years, that relationship has grown. We talk with each other fairly regularly about a myriad of different products. They had announced before this that they were doing a licensed version of Castle Panic with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And there was the Lower Decks game that they were doing, and they've got all kinds of licenses with fighting games and different anime licenses and things like that they're doing with their primary game, which is Universes. And if you look at, since they took it over in the graphic design of that game although My Hero was better towards the end, if you look at the stuff that they've done with Critical Role, the stuff that they've done with Attack on Titan, with basically manga frames to work with, they have some of the best looking frames, they have some of the best looking treatments, they have some of the best artwork that any card game has out there. And their quality of card stock is really good. So I'm very excited to see, depending on what they get to work with inside of this project, and how, I don't know how the deal is structured. We don't have those types of conversations. I'm not sure what they're allowed to do and what they can't do. Basically, I have just what's available in the press release and what the commercials were that we've seen so far. I'm not sure how much of a hand they're going to get to have in terms of doing that sort of thing. I'm encouraged. I think that from what I know from talking to a bunch of other people, there were a number of people that wanted to be able to handle this distribution, and they were the ones that actually won this thing out. So I know some other people that were sort of at the table with Riot that wanted to get involved with distributing this thing. So I would guess that a part of that process was likely because of how nice their cards look and that sort of thing. And if they needed to make an adjustment on the frames, they'd be a great partner to be able to do that with. A little bit about the brand. I did a little bit of a deep dive. In between the Riot Games ecosystem, based on what the internet spit out to me, they've got over 180 million active players spread out over their games. Very deeply engaged fan base. Their esports numbers are significant for a bunch of the different games that they do. The League of Legends opening ceremony for Worlds is always something that I watch every year. They have insane performers. The soundtrack for all of those Worlds competitions are always fantastic. They've got Imagine Dragons and a whole bunch of different people that do stuff for there. And now they've expanded into media. A handful of you know, or if you haven't had a chance to check it out, I can't tell you more than to go to Netflix and watch Arcane. Arcane, the first season and the second season were phenomenal. So they're branching out. They're taking the license, they're branching it out, they're making it a little wider, which is growing the fan base, which is increasing curiosity as well. They had a small board game that they did a little while back called Mechs and Minions. That wasn't something that was available to retail, though we've sold a handful of those copies because we do used. So every time one comes in, we will buy that and we will sell that. They also did some sort of children's book type stuff. And if you go to the Riot store, you can see they've gone down the path quite a ways in different areas of merchandising. But this is the first time they're doing something that's paper. There's no miniatures game, there's no role-playing game, there's no board game aside from that one that they created. I think there was a little card game that they did as well that was just a standard card game, not an expandable card game. Obviously, one of the exciting parts about having the ability to sell Project K is just the fact that there's that giant consumer base that's potentially already built in there, that's familiar with the lore, that's familiar with the game, that's familiar with the universe, and it's ever growing because more and more people are watching Arcane all the time. I think the numbers on it were pretty exceptional as far as Netflix goes, and I believe they're going to continue on with that brand. So in terms of built-in player base, it's already there. There's a whole bunch of people that are there. Now, us as retailers, the trick is, how do we get those players off the computer when they're playing the normal game or they're playing Teamfight Tactics or anything else, to get them to come into the store to play the game in paper form? They had Legends of Runeterra for a long time. I played a lot of that game. I went in and out of it like I butterfly out of a whole bunch of different games. So Legends of Runeterra was a really good time. It came out sort of right in the middle of the pandemic, and I don't remember what they said. I know the monetization structure was part of the reason why they decided to stop updating that game and things like that, but people make adjustments all the time. So we're going to have the opportunity now to sell the paper game. There's a nice crossover appeal too that happens between the casual players and the ingrained players as well. So it's a big giant license that's coming into our world that for the first time we're really going to be able to make some revenue on that sort of thing. So I want to talk about the game mechanics. There's been a whole bunch of different videos out there from a bunch of different content creators. So I want to sort of look at more of a high level conversation and just some broad strokes things that I can talk about with regard to what the game is itself. I was able to take some decks with me from the show, so I've run a couple of my employees through that, and we're going to continue to do that. And soon we're going to schedule some stuff to get some of the local players playing the game. But the conversation that I had with the Riot team is, these are very early cards. There's some adjustments that may be made to the gameplay. There's some adjustments that may be made to some of the cards and stuff. This is just an early example of this, and that was parroted by the influencers that are out there that sort of went to the digital world and talked about the game already. I think the easiest way for me to describe this game is that it has familiar ingredients with a brand new recipe. And what I mean by that is, what we saw, I was able to have a small meeting at Gamma before they went down to the floor. So I grabbed a handful of retailers that I have a close relationship with, brought them up to our suite. We got to talk with the Riot team directly before they went down to the floor and ask them some questions and do some of that. And what was encouraging about the game is when we played through it, despite the fact that they talked about making some adjustments and things like that, most of the players in the room were card game players. They were familiar with card games. They played cards games before. It took us about 5 minutes to learn the game, which is really nice. Talking to them sort of throughout the show, as they were running other people through that weren't necessarily card game players, it took them about 25 minutes to get up and going. And that's sort of in line with what it takes to get somebody on board for something like Star Wars Unlimited, One Piece, Lorcana. So in terms of being in the modern space for getting a card game, getting a player up to speed with feeling familiar with the mechanics and enough so that they can play with some level of competency, it's in line with modern card games. And if I compare that to what their other card game is, Universus is on the other scale of that. I said probably outside of Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's one of the most technical card games on the planet, and it takes a lot of decision making to be able to play the game optimally. In this one, while there's a whole bunch of decisions and there's things that you have to do, it's certainly designed more in a modern space that's more palpable for players that aren't familiar with TCGs. But to use a trope, there's enough hooks in there to make people that are familiar with TCGs want to play. You build a deck, you have a legend. Your legend's going to represent the colors of the deck that you're allowed to play. It's going to have a static ability or an activated ability, so it's either something that's turned on all the time and it comes into play based on whenever that trigger occurs, or you're going to have some ability to pay for something to activate it. Each player brings a battlefield. You're going to fight over these battlefields. The first person to control the battlefields or hold the battlefields for 8 points worth of turns is the winner. That's as simple as I can possibly make it. The card types in it are units, spells, gear. Inside of spells, though, critically, which this is probably something that I was more excited about than I should be. It feels like a lot of modern games now are designed in a way where while I'm playing against an opponent, it's a fairly solitary experience on my side. I do my stuff. They can't really interact or engage with my stuff, and then they do their stuff. And maybe it's a little bit of a back and forth, but this game actually has reactions. So some of your spells are reactions. Reactions occur based on what the reaction itself does and how it triggers based on what your opponent's doing or what you're doing. So it's nice that there's some interaction between me and my opponent as we're doing things. Some games don't have that really involved in it whatsoever, which can be frustrating when I don't feel like I'm actually allowed to do anything to stop them doing what they're doing that isn't just on the board or obvious. So it's nice to see that they have that. The downside to it is it can create some really interesting time windows. So we'll see what their core rules look like and how streamlined that is and how easy it is to be able to manage reactions in general. But I'm certainly glad that they have it. So in terms of similarities for gameplay, it's similar to Magic the Gathering in that if you've played Commander, you have your legend there, but you also get one card that pops out of your deck that you have access to as if it's in your hand already. You start the game with access to that thing. Unlike Commander, when it dies, it just goes to your graveyard, and it's based on whichever legend you have is what the card is that you can have out there. It has a resource system that's similar to One Piece. So you're going to have a specific deck that's a rune deck where you're going to be able to play 2 of those cards per turn off the top of your deck. Where it's different is they have a recycle mechanic that's part of the payment cost. So you're going to exhaust your runes depending on how many you need to play a particular card, and then some of them have a recycle cost. And the recycle cost, what that does is it throws the rune back into your deck for you to have to be able to use later. We're fighting in 2 battle zones, so it feels a little bit like SWU, a little bit like Altered that way. The biggest difference is you can control those things and you can move your characters back and forth in those. So you have a base yourself, and then you have the 2 battlegrounds that you're fighting over. You can move back and forth from your base to your battlegrounds. You can move to their battlegrounds. You just can't move between unless you have an ability called ganking, which makes sense if you know the license at all. Ganking is something that happens inside and outside of the jungle. So there's some movement. That's a little old school. Like I'm a Doomtown player from many, many years ago. I like the fact that there's some mechanics that let me move my characters to and from different zones. That's kind of fun. And it's not like SWU in that, this side is land and this side is space. They're battlefields that you bring to the game that trigger different abilities based on whether or not you can hold those battlefields as well. I mean, there's a massive amount of characters, and there's a huge pool of lore from both Arcane that they can pull from. They've got their own lore, which there's an intense amount of that. There's lore that's built in from Legends of Runeterra. There's lore that's actually built in from the game itself. So there's a whole lot of history that's sort of built into the game and factions and that sort of stuff. You can see some of that on the cards. I'm not sure how they're going to express it in the new frames, but there's different areas that different champions and legends and stuff like that come from. So it's definitely something that has an unending amount of area for them to be able to work with. On top of that, the characters behind me some of them have 20 or 30 or 40 like skins themselves, which is another thing that the amount of money that I've spent on this game personally is in the thousands of dollars. So there's a lot of skins out there for these heroes and these champions and stuff. So there's a lot of different ways that they can have different versions of these heroes as well. So it's not like it's just going to be built off of that. I think they're over 100 champions at this point for sure. So there's a lot of different space that they have that they can work with inside. Oh, the other thing is 6 colors. So not 5 colors, not 4 colors, but there's 6 colors that they're working with as well. The demo decks that we've been able to play with have all been 2 colors, but your legend determines what color your deck is going to be when you play the game. For retail considerations, is there a space for this on the shelf? What type of store would carry this, and why would you want to do that? I sort of touched on some of that to begin with. If you have a bunch of card gamers that play here or that play in your store, it's a very, very simple thing to learn. There's a lot of dynamism between the different things that you can do with the cards, your units, and how you're interacting with the board itself. But if you sell a bunch of card games now and you have any number of League of Legends fans, I think there's a big opportunity for you to do really well with this. We'll see as they do more announcements. Hopefully they announce the name soon. Project K, having to say Project K over and over and over again. I think we're ready for the name. So if anybody from Riot or anybody from UVS is watching, feel free to just give us a name. Give us something that we can call this thing so that I don't have to continue to call it the working title of Project K. I think it'll add a lot of blood to the actual game itself. Organized play is a huge part of what UVS does currently with universes, so I'm going to assume that Riot's going to lean into them a little bit to make sure that they have events. The amount of different events that they can have, there's a ton. There's obviously a huge esports connection there. They could look at doing something, and I'm speculating here, I don't know this for sure, but they could certainly do store esports teams in terms of having stores have representative teams that play in different tournaments like we do in other TCGs. There's a lot of crossover branding that goes with that. Riot has obviously a ton of different resources available to them and a bunch of different assets that they can lean into for this. Like, it'd be really nice to be able to go to one of their bigger shows, whether it's an MSI or Worlds or one of their events, and be able to play in a tournament outside of the building before the actual event itself. I think there's cool opportunities there. They've done a whole bunch of collaborations themselves, so they could certainly mix this in, and it allows us to get to sort of a broader audience than a lot of the other licenses that we've been able to use before. The other thing is, for us, it's a fresh license. Like, we've never taken a crack at this thing. It's not like, I wouldn't be upset or annoyed if the Batman card game came out. Like, they announced the Godzilla card game, so I'm going to sell some Godzilla card game. But this is sort of untapped waters for us. We haven't gotten to play with any of these characters. We haven't really gotten to mess around with this universe at all. So it is a fresh license, even though it's a licensed product. And it's one of the the top 2 or 3 that if I could wave a magic wand to be able to sell, to be able to look at, this is certainly one of them. Hopefully it goes well enough where, I'd love to get to the point where I could look at my store potentially carrying some of the different merchandise that they sell in the Riot store, sort of what Darrington Press does with their Critical Role stuff. I'd love to be able to sell t-shirts and figures and hats and different things like that. Plus, if I'm getting it at wholesale, it'd be a little cheaper for me personally, which that doesn't hurt on the old bank account for sure. We haven't seen anything yet in terms of set release and cadence. I think that the press release said something about Q4-ish on this launch. I know that the Chinese version is going to come out at the same time or very similar to that. So there's some timing that they're working out and that sort of thing. So that's something that you got to be conscious of. I'm positive that, they just announced, they just had the press release last Friday, or was it Monday? I don't remember what day, but whatever day it was, it hasn't been that long. I'm sure they're working behind the scenes to be able to get all that information updated and to give us a good idea of sort of what they're looking to do in this, as well as I'm positive they're looking at a way to be able to get more cards into players' hands and retailers' hands to sort of let them feel and taste the game before they get to the point where they need to do some purchasing. The other thing to think about is the TCG market's booming right now. There's fierce competition, but this is the type of license that can come in and be disruptive. Riot is somebody that can be disruptive in general. They have a massive fan base, as I've said. UVS has this year come out with a really aggressive tournament series for universes. So even if they were sort of I don't know if they're going to combine their tournament series together, if Project K is going to have its own. So I'm looking forward to see what that sort of looks like as well. The thing that I can tell you is that Riot doesn't really deal with anything where they don't launch something with long-term plans. Everything that they've done before, they've sort of had a beginning, a middle, and an end, where they were looking at the totality of this thing and how long it's going to go. So from an investment standpoint, I've said this on the show before, 2 other times. I talked about Star Wars Unlimited being the largest single first set investment that I've ever made. And then I said the same thing about Altered. I will say that this will once again be the largest first set investment that I've ever made. So Altered and Star Wars Unlimited will be off to the side. This will be the largest thing that I've ever purchased on a first set. It's a big one. I think it's 298 cards is what the bottom of the thing said. So that's a big, nice chunky core set. So I'm going to be as engaged as I can possibly be as a retailer for this. That said, we're still cranking along on Magic. We still do really well with Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, One Piece, Lorcana, SWU, and Gundam's coming too. So this year, in terms of a year for TCGs, is pretty wild. One of the things that I was asked a lot about at Gamma, and I sort of talked about it on the show previously, is what is it about all these TCGs that have been successful? Why are there so many of them that are doing so well now, when it feels like it's really difficult? It's a lot harder trudging in the board game universe. And I think that it has something to do with just the difference in the amount of time that we have to spend learning things. If I bring a new board game in, I have to learn that board game, and then I have to decide if I'm going to train my staff. And if I'm going to train my staff, I have to sell enough copies to make it past whatever the investment was to do that training, on top of the cost of the games, the merchandising of the games, the unpacking of the game, the processing of the games, and those sort of things. And that's just one title. Now, maybe there'll be expansions for that at some point, so the expansions will just be a continuation of that game. But I have to do that for 8,000 to 9,000 potential games that come out in any given year. If I teach one of my employees or one of my customers how to play Project K, yes, the expansions are going to add in new things. They're going to add in new characters. They're going to have new cards as well. But the fundamentals of the game is the same. They know how to play the game now, I'm going to have this expandable product release that's going to go on in perpetuity. And on top of that, there's all of the other stuff that we already know how to do. We already know how to run tournaments for this game. With board games, it's a little bit more challenging. It's a little trickier. You can say the same thing about role-playing games. You can say the same thing about miniatures. It takes a lot more investment in terms of setup, round clocks, different things like that. A lot of times as a retailer, you have to be creative, where with tournaments for TCGs, we all kind of know how to do that. If you have an organized play space, more than likely you have card games that you're playing in that space the majority of the time. We're kind of an outlier given how many non-card game events, and I say that fully knowing that we run, 24 card game tournaments in a week, probably on a regular week, without talking about specialty events and pre-release events and things like that. So card games for us is really easy, and I think that's the reason why retailers and consumers are absorbing as much of it as they are, because they sort of know the fundamentals of it. And there's a whole pile of new people that are coming in. They're trying some stuff out and they're moving to another space. The other benefit is they're singles. Right? I don't really have singles as an opportunity for board games and role-playing, although we do buy used for both of those, and miniatures as well. It's just not part of the marketplace, right? We understand how to crack boxes. We understand how to price singles. We understand how to put them on TCG Player and use that as an additional place to do get revenue streams up and flowing. Onboarding people into a card game versus a board game means that there's longevity there, or potentially longevity there. If they get into the game, they understand the community, they like the community, that's a long-term customer that we're creating with very measured amounts of times when they're going to visit for new products and new events that we can host and that sort of thing. So I think from the perspective of people that are concerned about how wide the market is in terms of TCGs, something to think about for that is I think the majority of the retailers right now are carrying Magic and Pokemon for sure. I think that the next rung of games that they're carrying are probably One Piece, Star Wars Unlimited, and Lorcana. And then below that, I think everybody else is sort of in this gladiator pit to get up. And there's sometimes when things are more popular. So I think that bottom third of whatever that equation is sort of in this constant churn. Well, One Piece hasn't been around for that long, and Star Wars Unlimited hasn't been around for that long, and Lorcana hasn't been around for that long, and it blitzed through a bunch of the games that have been around longer than them, just based on the amount of community and the amount of packs that we're selling and that sort of thing. I think that there's a real chance that this game could do the same thing. And these are diehard customers that want an opportunity to play the game outside of the digital space, and the opportunities between the stuff that UVS has managed to do with the Universes game, given what they got it in the state that it was in, to where they are now. What they're doing now is impressive. It's modern. It's firing in all cylinders. They've got a good talent pool there in all the different areas that they need, and they do games really, really well. It'll be interesting to see what they do with a game. Instead of having a game like Universus, which was fractured or broken or had a really, a rough past, and it was a complex game with a lot of different challenges that were on board, they get to start this one sort of fresh. So I'm interested to see what that UVS team does with this thing, with the collaboration for Riot. I'm excited that Riot's going to let us play in the pool a little bit, because it's certainly an IP that I've wanted to play around with for a long time. So closing thoughts for this week is, I assume that they're not going to make a ton of changes to the fundamentals of the card game. The card game itself is fun. It plays well. It's easy to teach. The game is compelling, and it plays pretty quick, which I like the fact that it can play pretty quick. Now, I'm positive I haven't seen 300 cards. I'm sure there's some stall decks and that sort of thing, because you're not going to ignore that side of a TCG in general, but the games that we played were fairly quick, which was good. If Riot and UVS can execute the launch well, handle the second set where we don't run into the same problem that a lot of other games that have been critical successes have run into with their second set. Sophomore set is almost more important than the first set. I think the first set's going to be explosive. I think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to get involved. I think there's going to be a whole ton of people there. The second set is the most important thing as far as longevity for the game goes, or how hard it is to get to the third set or the fourth set. So I hope they manage the second set really well. I hope it's not underpowered. I hope it's not underdelivered. I hope it's not overprinted. I hope it doesn't crash the market and that sort of thing. Hopefully they have the discipline to be able to make it where they're looking at this as a long-term plan and not a short-term plan. I'm not worried about how busy the marketplace can be, because there's card games that are rising and falling all the time. I mean, I was a huge proponent of Altered out of the gates. They weren't able to get their technology in line, so now that game is a shell of what it was. And the tough humble pie thing for me to eat on all that was when I was talking about Altered, and I was excited about Altered, and I was talking about all the great innovative things that we're going to do with that game. It was actually Paul from UVS that said what they're trying to do, and he's an innovative person and one of the brighter young minds in the industry. He said what they're trying to do with all these different innovations is going to be really, really difficult to pull off. Take a more measured approach to the game, because they're messing around with currencies, their marketplace, they've got print on demand they're trying to do unique cards. All of those things are a really heavy lift to do, and I was too excited and too enthusiastic with the opportunity to be able to do that, to listen to him. And lesson learned. Sometimes when we try to be overly innovative and stuff and we can't pull it off, what ends up happening is we let a whole bunch of people down. So I hope that the Alter team gets their stuff together and get all of those things humming. But right now, where that was a game that I was super, super high on, I am not high on it anymore. And this is a new thing that's going to be able to fit sort of that target marketplace. And it has some similarities, oddly enough, to what the Altered player experience is looking for. So I'm going to wrap it up for today. Thanks so much for coming by. I had a great time talking about Project K. Next week, we're going to talk about some other topic that has to do with games. No surprise for that. So until next time, happy gaming, happy retailing.